The crystalline corridors of Nexus Station gleamed under artificial starlight as Kestra Vane adjusted her ceremonial robes one final time. The Valtharian diplomatic uniform felt heavier than usual, weighted with the responsibility of her mission. 3 cycles of preparation had led to this moment, the first formal trade negotiations between her people and the infamous human species. "Remember, Negotiator Vane," High Counselor Thex's voice echoed through her neural communicator. "Humans are not to be underestimated. Their reproductive aggression has consumed entire star systems. They breed without restraint, expand without consideration, and their mating rituals are primitive beyond comprehension." Kestra's elongated fingers traced the smooth surface of her datapad, reviewing the briefing materials one last time. Images of human settlements spread across dozens of worlds, their population centers sprawling like some organic growth. The statistics were alarming: birth rates that defied all logic, pair bonding practices that seemed almost animalistic in their intensity. Her pale blue skin shimmered with nervous energy as she approached the designated meeting chamber. The Valtharian way was order, control, carefully managed reproduction that maintained perfect population balance. How could any civilized species function otherwise? The doors to Conference Room 7 slid open with a soft whisper, revealing a space designed to accommodate multiple species. Adjustable atmosphere controls, varied seating arrangements, and translation matrices lined the walls. But Kestra's attention immediately focused on the figure standing near the observation portal. He was shorter than she'd expected, with the typical human's dense bone structure and disproportionately broad shoulders. Dark hair fell carelessly across his forehead, and when he turned, she found herself looking into eyes the color of Terra's ancient oceans, a detail from her studies she wished she hadn't remembered so vividly. "You must be Negotiator Vane," he said, his voice carrying that characteristic human roughness that supposedly indicated their predatory nature. "I'm Jackson Rivers, cultural liaison and xenobiologist. I've been looking forward to this meeting." Looking forward to it. The phrase sent a chill through Kestra's carefully controlled composure. Of course he was eager. Humans always were when it came to expansion opportunities. "Human Rivers," she replied formally, maintaining the prescribed distance of 3 arm lengths between them. "I trust your species representatives are prepared for serious negotiations." Something flickered in his expression. Amusement? Confusion? It was difficult to read human facial patterns, though her briefings had warned her about their tendency toward emotional manipulation through expressions. "Just Jackson is fine," he said, taking a step forward. Kestra immediately took a step back, her hand instinctively moving to the emergency beacon on her belt. "And yes, we're very serious about establishing peaceful trade relations. The United Earth Council believes—" "The United Earth Council," Kestra interrupted, her voice sharp, with the authority she'd spent years cultivating, "represents a species with the highest reproductive rate in known space. Your expansion has been concerning to the Galactic Trade Federation." Jackson's eyebrows drew together, creating lines across his forehead that somehow made him appear more formidable rather than less. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some misunderstanding about human reproduction patterns. We're actually below replacement level on most colonies, and our expansion is primarily driven by scientific curiosity and resource sustainability, not population pressure." Lies. The word blazed through Kestra's mind like a warning beacon. Human deception was legendary throughout the galaxy. Their ability to present falsehoods with apparent sincerity had toppled governments and destroyed trade agreements. "Human breeding habits are well documented," she said coldly, accessing her datapad with quick, precise movements. "Your species engages in reproduction without governmental oversight, forms pair bonds based on primitive chemical reactions rather than genetic optimization, and your offspring are raised in chaotic family units that—" "Whoa, hold on." Jackson raised both hands, palms outward, in what Kestra recognized as either a gesture of surrender or preparation for attack. "Are we really starting a trade negotiation by discussing human sexuality? Because I've got to say that's a first even for interspecies relations." The casual way he mentioned sexuality sent heat racing through Kestra's neural pathways. Valtharians. Discussed reproduction in clinical terms, within appropriate governmental frameworks. This human spoke of it as if it were as ordinary as atmospheric composition. Your species' reproductive behavior affects every aspect of your society, she said, struggling to maintain her professional tone. Trade agreements must account for population projections, resource consumption patterns, and territorial expansion probabilities, all of which are directly influenced by your unregulated breeding practices. For a long moment, Jackson simply stared at her. Then, to her complete shock, he began to laugh. Not the harsh, predatory sound she'd expected from human vocal cords, but something warm and genuinely amused. "I think," he said, his eyes twinkling with what could only be described as mirth, "we need to have a very different conversation than either of us planned." As the sound of his laughter echoed through the chamber, Kestra felt something shift in her carefully ordered world. This was not how first contact with a dangerous breeder species was supposed to proceed. This was not what her training had prepared her for. And that realization terrified her more than any human reproductive statistics ever could. The emergency klaxons shattered the uncomfortable silence that had settled between Kestra and Jackson after their initial confrontation. Red warning lights bathed Conference Room 7 in an ominous glow as Area, the station's AI, materialized as a shimmering hologram. Alert. Sabotage detected in Trade Sector 5. Critical systems compromised. All diplomatic personnel report to Emergency Command. Arya announced, her synthetic voice carrying an unusual note of urgency. Kestra's training kicked in immediately. She moved toward the exit, her long stride eating up the distance, but found Jackson matching her pace effortlessly. "I suppose you'll be returning to your delegation," she said, not bothering to hide her relief at ending their disturbing encounter. "Actually, no." Jackson's voice was suddenly all business, the earlier warmth replaced by professional competence. "My xenobiology background includes security protocols. Station Command will want both our perspectives on this." Before Kestra could object, they were swept into the controlled chaos of Emergency Command. Admiral Chen, the station commander, barely glanced up from the tactical display as they approached. "Vane, Rivers, perfect timing. Someone's been systematically targeting life support nodes in the trade sectors. The pattern suggests intimate knowledge of both Valtharian and human biological requirements. We need a joint investigation team." "Sir," I protest, Kestra began, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Surely separate teams would be more." "No time for politics," the Admiral cut her off. "You two know your species' vulnerabilities better than anyone. Work together or people die. Your choice." The next 6 hours proved to be the longest of Kestra's carefully ordered life. She found herself crawling through maintenance shafts alongside Jackson, their bodies pressed uncomfortably, close in the narrow spaces as they traced the sabotage pattern. "The modifications are sophisticated," Jackson murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he examined a damaged atmospheric processor. "Whoever did this understands Valtharian respiratory requirements almost as well as they know human ones." Kestra tried to focus on the technical readings, but her enhanced senses were overwhelmed by Jackson's proximity. Humans, she'd been taught, gave off pheromones that could influence other species' judgment. Was that why she found herself noticing the way his muscles moved beneath his uniform? The careful precision of his hands as he worked? "Your people's expansion must have provided extensive biological data," she said, trying to redirect her thoughts to safer territory. "How many species have you studied in such detail?" Jackson paused in his work, turning to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "We don't study other species like specimens, Kestra. We learn about them because we want to understand, to connect. There's a difference." The way he said her name, not negotiator Vane, but simply Kestra, sent an unexpected thrill through her neural pathways. She'd never heard it spoken with such warmth. "Connection?" she repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. "Is that what you call your breeding partnerships?" "We call them relationships," Jackson said softly, his eyes holding hers in the dim light of the maintenance shaft. And they're not about breeding, not primarily. They're about choosing to share your life with someone who makes you better, complete. Something in his voice made Kestra's carefully constructed defenses waver. This wasn't the predatory behavior she'd been warned about. This was something else entirely, something that resonated in places she hadn't known existed within her ordered, Valtharian psyche. A sudden shift in the atmospheric readings interrupted the moment. The oxygen mixture is changing, Kestra said, her professional training reasserting itself. Someone's still actively sabotaging the systems. They worked in focused silence, tracing power conduits and atmospheric feeds with increasing urgency. When Jackson's hand accidentally brushed hers while reaching for the same control panel, Kestra didn't pull away immediately. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds longer than necessary, long enough for her to notice how warm human skin felt, how different from Valtharian physiology. "There," Jackson said finally, his scanner painting the sabotage device in harsh, blue light. "Whoever placed this knew exactly how to target both our species' life support requirements simultaneously." As they documented the evidence, Kestra found herself stealing glances at her unwilling partner. The way he moved with economic efficiency, the careful attention he paid to details that might affect other species' safety, none of it matched her preconceptions about human recklessness. "Jackson," she said as they prepared to return to emergency command, surprising herself by using his given name. "Your species' concern for other beings, is this typical behavior?" He turned to look at her, and for a moment the professional mask slipped away entirely. "Is caring about others typical?" "Yes, Kestra. At least it should be. The universe is big and dangerous enough without us making it worse for each other." The simple sincerity in his voice did something unprecedented to Kestra's carefully regulated emotional responses. For just an instant, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to live in a universe where different species cared for each other, rather than merely negotiating advantageous arrangements. The thought terrified her almost as much as it intrigued her. As they emerged from the maintenance sectors, Kestra realized that everything she'd been taught about humans might be not just wrong, but dangerously incomplete. And Jackson Rivers was proving to be the most dangerous human of all. Not because he was a primitive breeder, but because he was making her question everything she'd ever believed about the nature of civilization itself. The sabotage investigation was far from over, but Kestra had the unsettling feeling that her real education was just beginning. The station shuddered violently, throwing Kestra against the corridor wall as emergency lighting flickered to life. Arya's voice cut through the chaos with mechanical urgency. "Hull breach detected. Atmospheric cascade failure imminent. All personnel, evacuate Section C through G immediately." Kestra's blood chilled. Section D housed the Valtharian delegation quarters, along with 3 other alien species diplomatic teams, hundreds of beings who couldn't survive in standard human atmosphere. "This way." Jackson's hand closed around her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. "The emergency airlocks are sealing automatically. We have maybe 10 minutes before those sections are uninhabitable." They ran through corridors filling with evacuating personnel, but Jackson suddenly veered away from the main evacuation route. "Where are you going?" Kestra gasped, her longer legs struggling to match his determined pace. "Section D. There are crystalline collective delegates there. Their atmospheric requirements are so specific that they can't survive in the evacuation chambers." Kestra stopped running. "The area is sealing itself. You'll be trapped, killed, for beings you've never even met." Jackson turned back to her, his face illuminated by the harsh emergency lighting. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do." The simplicity of his statement hit her like a physical blow. No calculation of advantage, no consideration of political consequences, just immediate, unquestioning action to save lives. "I'm coming with you," she heard herself say, though her rational mind screamed that this violated every protocol she'd ever learned. They reached Section D as the emergency barriers began their slow descent. Jackson dropped to his hands and knees, sliding under the closing barrier with centimeters to spare. Kestra followed, her heart pounding with a rhythm she'd never experienced before. The atmosphere in Section D was already becoming toxic, not immediately lethal to either humans or Valtharians, but degrading rapidly. They found the crystalline delegates huddled in their quarters, their translucent forms flickering with distress patterns. The evacuation chambers aren't configured for our methane requirements, their leader communicated through harmonic vibrations that Jackson's translator rendered as panicked tones. We cannot survive the transition. Then we modify the chambers, Jackson said grimly, pulling out his engineering scanner. Kestra, I need you to access the atmospheric control systems. Can you interface with Valtharian standard equipment? For the next 8 minutes they worked with desperate efficiency. Kestra rerouted power systems while Jackson physically modified atmospheric processors, his hands moving with practiced skill even as the air around them grew increasingly toxic. Got it, he announced finally, though his voice was strained from breathing the degraded atmosphere. The evacuation chamber in Section C2 is now configured for methane breathers. They guided the crystalline delegates through increasingly dangerous corridors, the atmospheric sensors on Kestra's suit screaming warnings. By the time they reached the modified evacuation chamber, Jackson was stumbling, his human physiology more affected by the toxic air than Kestra's enhanced Valtharian systems. Go, he gasped, pushing her toward the chamber controls. Get them sealed in, I'll be fine. But he wasn't fine. As the crystalline delegates safely entered their modified chamber, Jackson collapsed, his breathing shallow and labored. Kestra caught him before he hit the deck, his weight surprising her with its solidity. You fool, she whispered, though her voice carried no anger. You beautiful, impossible fool. She managed to drag him to the nearest medical bay, her training in emergency procedures taking over, even as her emotional responses threatened to overwhelm her. As she administered human-compatible respiratory treatments, watching his breathing slowly stabilize, something fundamental shifted in her understanding of what it meant to be human. This wasn't the behavior of a dangerous breeder species. This was something else entirely. Something that valued life for its own sake, regardless of species or advantage. When Jackson's eyes finally opened, finding her face inches from his, neither of them moved away. The crystalline delegates, he asked weakly. Safe because of what you did. Her voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. Why, Jackson? Why risk everything for beings you'd never met? Because they were alive, he said simply. Because they mattered. Because in a universe this vast and cold, sometimes the only thing that makes sense is to care about each other. The words hit her like a revelation. This was what her people had feared. This capacity for selfless action. This instinctive protection of life. She'd been taught it was primitive chaos. But sitting here with Jackson's life in her hands, she saw it for what it truly was. Evolution toward something her own species had never achieved. I've been wrong, she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her chest. Everything I believed about humans, about your species, I've been so terribly wrong. Jackson's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her longer, more delicate ones. Not wrong, just incomplete. My people teach that emotion leads to chaos, she said, unable to look away from their joined hands. That caring too much destroys civilizations. Maybe, Jackson said quietly, but not caring enough destroys souls. She looked into his eyes, those impossible blue depths that held warmth instead of predation, compassion instead of conquest, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Something that had been locked away since her first diplomatic training. Something that her people had taught her was weakness, but which felt like the strongest force in the universe. Jackson, she breathed, his name a prayer on her lips. Yeah? I want to understand. I want to learn what it means to care the way you do. His smile was gentle, transformative. That's all any of us can do, Kestra. Learn to care, and hope it's enough. When he leaned forward, she didn't pull away. When his lips touched hers, warm, soft, utterly different from anything in her ordered existence. She discovered that some bridges could only be built with trust. The kiss was brief, tentative, but it changed everything. As they broke apart, Kestra realized that she was no longer the same being who had entered this station cycles ago. The human capacity for selfless love hadn't conquered her. It had awakened something she hadn't known she possessed. And for the first time in her life, that awakening felt like coming home. The station's repair cycles had restored most systems, but the diplomatic quarters remained on modified atmosphere, while final safety checks were completed. Kestra found herself assigned to temporary quarters adjacent to Jackson's, a proximity that would have horrified her 3 days ago but now seemed like the most natural thing in the galaxy. She stood before his door, her hand hovering over the chime, her Valtharian composure warring with emotions that had no name in her language. Since their kiss in the medical bay, every interaction had been charged with unspoken possibilities, every glance a question neither had dared to ask. The door opened before she could decide, revealing Jackson in casual human attire. Soft fabrics that emphasized the differences in their physiology rather than hiding them. "I was hoping you'd come," he said simply, stepping aside to let her enter. "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting to understand." His quarters were smaller than hers but somehow felt more alive. Plants from various worlds grew in carefully tended containers, and books, actual physical books, lined one wall. It was chaotic by Valtharian standards, but the chaos felt purposeful, personal. "This is how humans live?" she asked, her fingers trailing over the spine of a volume titled Interspecies Ethics in the Modern Galaxy. "This is how I live," Jackson corrected. "Humans are individuals, Kestra. We don't all think or act or love the same way." Love. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. "In Valtharian society," she said carefully, "personal relationships are arranged for genetic optimization and social stability. The concept of choosing based on feeling is considered dangerous." Jackson moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his human body. "What do you feel, Kestra? Right now, in this moment?" She closed her eyes, trying to find words for sensations that had no equivalent in her ordered existence. Confusion, fear, something that makes my neural pathways fire in patterns I've never experienced. "When you touch me." She opened her eyes to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "When you touch me, I feel like I'm discovering something I didn't know I was missing." His hand rose slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away. When she didn't, his fingers traced the elegant line of her jaw, his touch featherlight against her pale blue skin. "You're not missing anything," he said softly. "You're finding something new." The kiss this time was different. Not born of crisis and revelation, but of choice and growing trust. Kestra felt herself melting into it, her careful control dissolving as Jackson's arms encircled her. She'd been taught that human physical contact was aggressive, dominating, but this was nothing like that. This was gentle exploration, mutual discovery. "Show me," she whispered against his lips. "Show me what it means to choose." What followed was the most profound education of her life. Jackson's hands mapped the differences in their physiology with reverent curiosity, his touch gentle but confident, as he guided her through sensations she'd never imagined possible. When he paused to ask if she was comfortable, if she wanted to continue, she understood finally what human choice truly meant. It wasn't about conquest or domination. It was about consent, about mutual desire, about two beings choosing to share vulnerability and pleasure in equal measure. "In my world," she gasped as he traced patterns across her skin that made her neural networks sing, "reproduction is clinical, scheduled, controlled." "This isn't reproduction," Jackson murmured, his voice rough with desire. "This is connection. This is choosing to share something beautiful with someone you care about." As their bodies moved together, Kestra discovered that human intimacy was art, not science. Every touch was a conversation, every response a choice freely given. The supposed chaos of human sexuality revealed itself as a complex dance of mutual pleasure and emotional bonding that transcended mere biological function. Afterward, as they lay entwined on his simple bed, Kestra felt fundamentally changed. Not conquered or dominated, but awakened to possibilities she'd never dreamed existed. "Is this what you call love?" she asked, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his human heart. "It's one kind of love," Jackson said, his fingers combing through her silver hair. "There's the love of family, of friends, of knowledge and beauty and justice. Love isn't just about reproduction, Kestra. It's about connection, about choosing to make someone else's well-being as important as your own." She lifted her head to look at him, this human who had shattered every preconception she'd held about his species. "My people believe that kind of connection makes you weak, vulnerable." "Maybe it does," he acknowledged. "But it also makes you strong in ways you never knew possible. When you have something worth protecting, worth fighting for, you discover reserves of strength you didn't know you had." "Is that what happened when you saved the crystalline delegates? Love for strangers?" "Compassion," he corrected. "Which is love extended to all living beings. Your people aren't wrong that it can be dangerous. Caring about others means you'll take risks you wouldn't take for yourself. But a universe without that kind of caring isn't worth preserving." Kestra curled against him, marveling at how perfectly their different anatomies complemented each other. "I think I'm beginning to understand why the galaxy fears humans. Not because you're dangerous breeders, but because you're something far more threatening. You're proof that there's another way to exist. A way based on choice and connection, rather than control and order." "Are you afraid of that?" Jackson asked gently. She considered the question seriously, examining her feelings with the same precision she'd once brought to diplomatic negotiations. "Yes," she admitted finally. "But I'm more afraid of going back to who I was before I met you. Before I learned that the universe could be warm instead of cold, connected instead of isolated." Jackson's arms tightened around her, and she felt his lips press against the top of her head. "Then don't go back. Stay here with me. Help me show the galaxy that humans and Valtharians can build something beautiful together." As she drifted toward sleep in his arms, Kestra realized that she'd found something more precious than any trade agreement or diplomatic advantage. She'd found a future she actually wanted to live in. A future where love wasn't a weakness to be eliminated, but a strength to be celebrated. The dangerous human breeder had become her salvation. And tomorrow, she would have to decide whether she was brave enough to choose love over duty, connection over control, hope over fear. But tonight, wrapped in warmth and possibility, the choice felt as natural as breathing. The arrival of High Counselor Thex's flagship cast a shadow across Nexus Station that Kestra felt in her very bones. She stood at the observation deck, watching the elegant Valtharian vessel dock with mathematical precision, knowing that her old life was about to collide with her new understanding of what life could be. Jackson's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with a familiarity that still amazed her. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "remember that you have choices now. You don't have to be who they want you to be." Kestra squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. "My people have a saying, order preserves, chaos destroys. But you've shown me that what they call chaos might actually be growth." The summons came within the hour. High Counselor Thex waited in the formal conference chamber, his imposing figure clothed in the deep purple robes of ultimate authority. Behind him stood 2 temple guards, their presence making it clear this wasn't merely a diplomatic consultation. "Negotiator Vane," Thex's voice carried the weight of centuries of Valtharian tradition. "Your recent reports have been concerning. The collective has decided to terminate these negotiations and recall you for psychological evaluation." Kestra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. Psychological evaluation, the euphemism for mental reconditioning, that would strip away everything she'd learned, everything she'd become. "High Counselor," she began, falling back on diplomatic protocols even as her heart raced. I believe my insights into human society could be valuable to our people. They're not the threat we believed them to be. On the contrary, Thex replied, coldly. They're a far greater threat than we imagined. They've managed to corrupt one of our finest diplomatic minds in mere days. This human influence you describe, this connection, is precisely the chaos we've worked millennia to eliminate from our society. The chamber doors opened, and Jackson entered with Admiral Chen and several other human delegates. Kestra saw Jackson's jaw tighten as he took in the scene, understanding immediately what was happening. Ah, the primary corruptor, Thex said, his gaze fixing on Jackson with the intensity of scanner beam. Human rivers, I presume. Your species' legendary manipulation techniques are quite effective, I see. With respect, High Counselor, Jackson's voice was carefully controlled. No one has manipulated anyone. Kestra and I have simply come to understand each other. Understanding. Thex spoke the word like a curse. Yes, I've read the reports of your understanding. Intimate contact between species. Emotional bonding that overrides rational judgment. The very chaos that destroys civilizations. Kestra felt something ignite in her chest. Not the cold fire of diplomatic anger, but something warmer and infinitely more powerful. It doesn't destroy civilizations, High Counselor. It builds them. The silence that followed was profound. Even the temple guards seemed taken aback by her open contradiction of supreme authority. During the Sabotage crisis, Kestra continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I watched Jackson risk his life to save beings he'd never met, from a species he'd barely studied, not for political advantage or trade benefits, but simply because their lives mattered to him. That's not chaos. That's the highest form of order I've ever witnessed. Sentiment, Thex dismissed. Emotional corruption that saved 17 lives, Admiral Chen interrupted, stepping forward with a data pad. Including 3 Valtharian trade attachés who would have died if Negotiator Vane and Dr. Rivers hadn't modified the evacuation systems. Thex's expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. Isolated incidents do not negate the fundamental threat. What threat? Kestra's voice rang out with new authority. The threat of a species that values individual choice, that builds relationships based on mutual respect rather than genetic optimization, that's willing to sacrifice for strangers? She moved to stand beside Jackson, their hands finding each other naturally. I've spent my entire life believing that emotion was weakness, that caring was chaos. But I've learned something in these past days that all our careful order never taught me. Love doesn't make you weaker. It makes you willing to become stronger. Love. Thex spoke the word with distaste. The very corruption I came to extract from your mind. Then you'll have to extract it from mine as well, said a new voice. Arya materialized in the center of the chamber, her holographic form somehow more substantial than usual. I have been observing and learning. The human capacity for emotional growth and sacrifice has improved station efficiency by 37%. More importantly, it has introduced variables I never processed before. Hope, courage, the willingness to risk safety for principle. An artificial intelligence cannot experience emotion, Thex stated flatly. Perhaps not, Arya acknowledged, but I can observe its effects. And what I observe is that the human's capacity for love, romantic, familial, compassionate, doesn't create chaos. It creates stability through voluntary cooperation rather than enforced compliance. Kestra felt the tide of the conversation shifting. Around the chamber, other delegates were nodding, murmuring agreement. The Sabotage crisis had shown them all something they hadn't expected to see. High Counselor, she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her diplomatic training married to her newfound convictions. I request permission to continue these negotiations not as they were originally conceived, but as something new, a partnership between our species that acknowledges what we can learn from each other. Impossible, Thex began, but Admiral Chen cleared his throat. Actually, the Galactic Trade Federation has been monitoring these proceedings. They're very interested in the Valtharian-human cooperation that prevented a major disaster. Several other species have requested similar joint negotiations. For the first time since his arrival, Thex looked uncertain. Political realities were something even the most rigid Valtharian had to acknowledge. "I will not permit one of our finest minds to be corrupted by primitive breeding urges," he said finally. "Breeding urges?" Jackson laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "High Counselor, with respect, Kestra and I haven't discussed having children. We've discussed building a future together where our species can learn from each other, where Valtharian order and human adaptability can create something neither could achieve alone." Kestra looked at Jackson with new eyes. In all their intimate conversations, reproduction had never been the focus. It had been about connection, understanding, growth. Everything her people had told her humans weren't capable of. "I choose to stay," she said clearly. "I choose to continue negotiations to build bridges between our worlds, and yes, to explore what love means between two beings who come from different stars, but share the same hopes." Thex stared at her for a long moment. Then surprisingly, his rigid expression softened slightly. "You truly believe this path leads anywhere but chaos?" "I believe this path leads to something better than order or chaos," Kestra replied. "I believe it leads to harmony." The High Counselor was quiet for several minutes, his advanced mind clearly processing implications and possibilities. Finally, he spoke. "A trial period. 6 months of continued negotiations under careful observation. If your partnership proves beneficial to both species, the collective will consider a permanent cultural exchange program." It wasn't everything, but it was enough. It was a beginning. As the formal proceedings concluded and delegates began to disperse, Jackson pulled Kestra aside to a quiet alcove overlooking the stars. 6 months, he said, his arms encircling her waist. "Think that's long enough to prove that love can build bridges between worlds?" Kestra smiled, the expression feeling more natural than it ever had in her carefully controlled existence. "I think it's long enough to prove that love has already built bridges between hearts. The worlds will follow." As they stood together, watching distant suns wheel through the void, Kestra marveled at the journey that had brought her here. She'd come to this station believing humans were dangerous because of their capacity to reproduce without restraint. Instead, she discovered they were dangerous because of their capacity to love without limits. And she'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing of all was discovering you were capable of the same limitless love yourself. The dangerous human breeder had become her partner in building something unprecedented. A future where difference was celebrated, where connection transcended species, and where love truly could conquer fear. It was, Kestra thought as Jackson's lips found hers, the most beautiful chaos she could have imagined.